Just sign here so we can get the house transferred and stop dragging this out. That's what my stepson said to me at my husband's memorial, before the coffee had even gone cold. I didn't argue. I didn't cry harder than I already had. I set the folder down on the linen tablecloth, next to a plate of little sandwiches nobody was eating, and I went to hug my cousin Denise, who'd driven 4 hours to be there. What Corey didn't know, what he wouldn't know for another 11 days, was that the folder he handed me wasn't the only folder on that table, and the one I picked back up when I returned wasn't the one he'd given me. He thought he was 3 days from getting what he needed. But what if the folder he actually handed me wasn't the trap? What if the trap was the one he never meant to hand me at all? He didn't know he was about to hand his own scheme to the one person in the room who still knew how to read a ledger. Welcome back to her calm revenge, where grief doesn't make a woman stupid, it just makes her quiet for a while. Stay with me to the end. Drop a comment, and be sure to subscribe, because this is one of those stories where the ending isn't the twist, it's the fourth one. My name is Marilyn Doyle. I'm 62 years old, and for 31 years, before I retired, I was a bookkeeper for 3 different family businesses in the same small town. A hardware store, a heating and air company, and a dry cleaner that's now a nail salon. I balanced other people's books so well that not one of those 3 businesses ever failed on my watch. Not one. Nobody at that memorial remembered that about me. To Corey, to the cousins, to half of Arthur's old golf buddies, I was just Arthur's wife. The second wife. Quiet, agreeable, good with a casserole dish. A woman who'd sign what she was handed because that's what wives like me were supposed to do. That's the thing about being underestimated. It isn't loud. Nobody announces it. They just hand you the folder and keep talking. I married Arthur Doyle 14 years ago, when I was 48 and had already buried 1 husband and raised 1 daughter, mostly alone. My daughter Catherine lives 2 states over now with a family of her own, and she was there at the memorial too. Though she'll tell you plainly, she never trusted Corey, not out of proof, just instinct. The kind daughters get about people who smile a half-second too late. She was the one who squeezed my hand under the table when Corey first walked toward us with that folder and whispered, "Don't sign anything today." Mom. I've thought about that a lot since. She didn't know what I'd find. She just knew the shape of the man asking. Arthur, when I met him, was a widower running a modest heating and air outfit 2 towns over. A man who fixed his own truck, wore the same brown jacket for a decade, and courted me slowly, over coffee that turned into dinner, that turned into Sunday drives with no destination. He never once tried to impress me with money he didn't have. What he impressed me with was attention, the kind that noticed when I was tired before I said so, the kind that remembered how I liked my coffee without being told twice. I fell for him the way you fall for someone in your late 40s, carefully and completely. Arthur had been divorced 11 years by then, with a grown son, Corey, who'd spent those 11 years performing warmth at family gatherings, the way some men perform interest in a conversation they're not actually having. Arthur saw it. He never said much about it. Arthur wasn't a man for speeches, but every so often he'd say something small that I only understood the size of much later. "Price it like it's worth something, Marilyn." That's what he told me the day we retitled the house into both our names, back when Corey's construction business was already wobbling. And Arthur, for reasons he didn't explain, wanted certain things spelled out in writing. He wasn't predicting the future. Arthur never claimed to see around corners. He just believed that if you built the paperwork carefully enough, the future couldn't surprise you as badly. He built that paperwork for 10 years. I didn't understand how much of it there was until the week after his funeral. I knew, vaguely, that Arthur had done some restructuring with Warren a couple of years before the diagnosis. He'd mentioned it once, over dinner. The way you'd mention having the gutters cleaned, and I hadn't asked for details, because I trusted him the way you trust a man who's never once given you a reason not to. I had no idea sitting across from him that night eating pot roast, that the sentence he'd tossed off so casually was going to be the exact thing that saved this family 2 years later. Arthur died on a grey Tuesday in October, 8 months after the diagnosis. In the bedroom he'd insisted on dying in instead of a hospital. I held his hand. I did not expect, 4 days later, to be standing at his memorial being handed a folder by his son before the flowers had even wilted. It wasn't the first time Corey had tried to make me feel like a placeholder in Arthur's life instead of a wife of 14 years. There'd been small cruelties before, the kind that don't show up on camera, that you'd have to have lived inside a family to recognize as cruelty at all. At Thanksgiving 2 years earlier, in front of 11 relatives, he'd raised his glass to the family Dad built the first time around, and let the silence after it do the rest of the work. While I sat there holding a serving spoon and a smile I'd practiced for exactly this kind of moment, Arthur had reached under the table that night and taken my hand without a word. He never made a scene. He just made sure I knew he'd noticed. At the memorial, Corey found a bigger stage than a dinner table. He stood at the podium during the eulogy portion and talked for 6 minutes about my father and I, and never once used the word we. Never once acknowledged 14 years of marriage sitting in the second pew in a black dress she'd bought for exactly this occasion. People noticed. I saw Denise's jaw tighten from 3 rows back. I sat with my hands folded and let it happen, because a memorial is not the place to correct a grieving man's arithmetic, even when the arithmetic leaves you out entirely. Corey Doyle is 51. He is Arthur's only child from his first marriage, and he has spent 3 decades convinced that warmth is a performance you give people, not a thing you feel for them. I don't say that with hatred. I say it because it's true, and because by the end of this story, you'll understand that Corey wasn't a monster. He was a desperate man who'd convinced himself that desperation gave him permission. At the reception, in the church basement, with the folding chairs and the coffee urn that always runs out too fast, Corey found me by the sandwich table. Marilyn. He said my name the way you'd say it to a co-worker you were easing into bad news. I know today's hard. I don't want to make it harder. But the house, we should get the paperwork moving. Just sign here, so we can get the house transferred and stop dragging this out. I looked at the folder. I looked at him. And I did the thing that would end up saving both of us, though neither of us knew it. Yet I set it down to hug my cousin. And when I came back, in the shuffle of paper plates and casserole dishes, I picked up the wrong folder. Inside wasn't a quitclaim deed. It was a list of numbers, unlabeled, in Corey's handwriting, cramped, hurried. The handwriting of a man doing math he didn't want anyone watching him do. I assumed it was nothing. Wedding budget, maybe. Business inventory. I put it in my bag out of habit. The same habit that made me alphabetize invoices for 31 years. And I didn't think about it again until that night. Before I tell you what those numbers meant, let me tell you about Warren. Warren Kessler had been Arthur's attorney for 20 years, a soft-spoken man with reading glasses that lived on a chain around his neck, who Arthur trusted the way some men trust, a good mechanic completely, and without needing to understand exactly why. Warren approached me at the reception, not to offer condolences, though he did that too, but to ask, quietly, whether anyone had asked me to sign anything that day. I told him about the folder. Warren's face did something I'd never seen it do in 14 years of knowing him. It went still. "Don't sign anything," he said. "Not today. Not this week. Call me before you sign anything at all." I want you to sit with that for a second, because I did. I went home that night, to an empty house that still smelled like Arthur's aftershave, and I sat at the kitchen table with a folder I'd taken by accident, and a lawyer's warning I didn't yet understand, and I thought, this isn't about a house. Not really. Not anymore. That night, unable to sleep, I finally opened the folder. The numbers resembled a payment schedule, monthly amounts, a running balance, a name at the top I'd never heard before, Doyle Restoration, LLC. Under a column marked Guarantor, in small print, was Arthur's name. I called Warren the next morning before 8. He was quiet, in a way I'd never heard from him before. A stillness that only comes from a man deciding how much truth to hand, someone still raw from a funeral. Then he told me, 18 months ago, while Arthur was already sick, weakened by chemo and wanting peace in what family he had left, Corey had asked him to co-sign a small business loan. For a contracting company that was already failing, Arthur had said yes. He never told me. I sat with that for a long moment. Not anger, not yet. Just the strange, cold vertigo of learning your husband, a man who spent a decade building paperwork like a fortress around you, had a soft spot he never mentioned. Arthur's foresight wasn't magic. It was behavior, built slowly, one insistence at a time. And even behavior like that has blind spots. His blind spot had a name, and it was standing at his memorial asking me to sign something. Warren confirmed it within the hour. The loan was 90 days delinquent. As guarantor, the estate meaning, in practice, me could be liable for the shortfall if Corey's business folded. Warren wasn't the only one Arthur had quietly put in my corner over the years. There was also Priya Anand, a loan officer at the credit union, who'd known Arthur since before I met him, and who Arthur used to say, sees a balance sheet the way some people see weather coming. I called her that same afternoon, not to ask her to do anything improper she wouldn't have, and I'd never have asked but to ask her, in plain terms, what 90 days delinquent actually meant for a small contracting outfit in a town this size. She didn't sugarcoat it. It means the bank stops being patient, she said. It means somebody's about to lose something, and it's usually not the bank. I thanked her, hung up, and sat with that sentence longer than I meant to. And that's when it clicked. Corey wasn't trying to steal the house out of greed. He was trying to get the deed transferred into his name specifically so he could leverage it for a second loan to cover the first one. The urgency, the let's not drag this out, the folder shoved at me before the funeral flowers had even wilted. None of it was about grief moving fast. It was about a ticking clock only he could see. I want to pause here, because this is usually where a story like this asks you to hate somebody, and I'm not going to do that. Corey wasn't a cartoon villain twirling a mustache over a mortgage. He was a man who'd built something with his own two hands, watched it start to die, and reached for the rope any drowning person reaches for, without checking first whether it was tied to anything. It doesn't make what he did right, it makes it human. And human is so much harder to forgive than a monster would have been. But I didn't know any of that yet, not the full shape of it, until 3 days later, in my own garage. I'd gone out for a bin of Arthur's tools, the ones I still hadn't been able to give away, and I heard Corey's voice through the wall, on the phone, not knowing I was standing 6 feet away, with a box of wrenches in my hands. She doesn't know yet, he said. If she signs by Friday, we're fine. Fine from what? I didn't yet know. But I knew. Standing there in that garage with sawdust on the floor, Arthur had swept 100 times that whatever fine meant, it wasn't fine for me. If you've ever had a moment where the person you trusted turns into a stranger through a wall you didn't mean to be standing behind, stay with me. This is where it turns. I called Warren that afternoon and asked him to check what Friday meant. He came back with an answer that made the whole thing bigger than a house. The contracting business had a balloon payment due that Friday 3 days away. If it wasn't covered, the bank would move to seize collateral. And Corey had listed our family house as that collateral, using a power of attorney he claimed Arthur had signed in his final month. A power of attorney, not a deed transfer request from a grieving son who wanted things settled. A document that let him act as Arthur, on Arthur's own house, without either of us knowing it existed. If you're still with me, this is usually the part of the story where people start typing in the comments, because this is where it stops being about a house and starts being about a signature. And there's a difference between those two things that I didn't fully understand myself until that week. A house is a place. A signature is a person's word standing in for them when they can't stand there themselves. Somebody had used Arthur's word without Arthur. That's not a property dispute. That's theft of the one thing he had left to give me after he was gone. Subscribe if you want to see where a woman goes when she realizes that's what's actually been taken from her, because it isn't rage. It's arithmetic, and I was very, very good at arithmetic. Warren had never seen it, never filed it, never so much as heard Arthur mention it. If it was real, it had never gone through him, which meant it was either sloppy or deliberate. Knowing Corey, the way I was starting to know him now, I didn't think sloppy was the right word. I found it myself 2 days later, not in Corey's things, but in Arthur's desk, tucked behind old insurance papers I was looking for. A power of attorney, signed, dated 4 months before Arthur died. I remember sitting very still, holding that paper, doing math in my head the way I used to do math over other people's ledgers. 4 months before he died, put that date squarely in the week. Arthur had been unconscious in the hospital, the week the doctors told me not to expect him to open his eyes again. I remembered that week down to the hour. I'd slept in a vinyl chair beside his bed for 6 nights straight. Arthur did not sign anything that week. Arthur couldn't have signed his own name that week. The notary listed on the document was a name I recognized, not a stranger pulled off the street, but Renee's uncle. Renee, Corey's fiancée. Family, adjacent enough to owe a favor, distant enough to plausibly deny it later, if it ever came to that. I didn't confront Corey. Not yet. I've never believed shouting solves anything a phone call can't solve better. I called the notary's office instead and asked, calmly, whether they could confirm the log entry for that date. There was no log entry, no record of a visit at all, which meant the notarization wasn't just backdated. It was fabricated, start to finish, on a piece of paper meant to move an entire house out from under a woman who was still sleeping in a vinyl hospital chair while it was supposedly being signed. I remember the woman on the phone at the notary's office going quiet for a moment before she answered. A pause that told me she understood exactly what her answer meant for whoever was asking. "Ma'am," she said, "I want to be careful here because I can hear this matters. But I'm looking at the book for that entire week, and there is no entry under that name, or under your husband's name, on that date, or any date near it. I'm sorry." I thanked her and hung up, and I sat at my kitchen table for a long time with my hands flat on the wood, needing the surface under them to be real, because nothing else in that week felt like it was anymore. I called Warren back and told him what I'd found, and for the first time in this whole ordeal, I heard something in his voice that wasn't caution. It was anger, quiet and loyally, but anger all the same. "Marilyn," he said, "what you're describing isn't a family disagreement. It's forgery, and if it's what it looks like, it's elder financial exploitation on top of it, given the timing." He didn't say it to frighten me. He said it because he needed me to understand the actual size of the thing I was holding, so that whatever I decided to do next, I'd decide it with clear eyes. Paper doesn't lie, people do. I want you to hold on to that line, because it's going to come back. Corey showed up at the house 2 days later, unannounced, sweating in a way that had nothing to do with the October chill. He needed the signature before Friday. He wasn't aggressive, not in the way you might expect from a man cornered. He was pleading, fast-talking, the words tumbling over each other, the way they do when a man knows he's out of good options and is trying to talk his way into a bad one anyway. He stood on the porch first, not inside some old habit of manners, even now, and I let him in only as far as the kitchen, the same kitchen where I'd sat with his father's payment schedule spread across the table 3 nights before. He noticed the table. I watched him notice it, and I watched him decide not to ask why there was a folder of numbers sitting there in plain sight. "Marilyn, please. This is keeping it in the family. Dad would have wanted this. He was going to leave me the house anyway. Eventually. I moved the timeline. That's all. I moved the timeline." His hands were doing something restless the whole time, turning his truck keys over and over, the way people do when their bodies know, before their mouths admit it, that the story they're telling isn't going to hold. I looked at him for a long moment before I answered. because I wanted to be sure my voice came out steady and not shaking with everything I'd learned in the last week. Which Arthur signed that form, Corey? I said. Because it wasn't the one I was married to. That Arthur was unconscious in a hospital bed the week you say he signed it. I was there. I held his hand every night. So tell me which Arthur signed it. Silence. His silence, this time, not mine. Paper doesn't lie, Corey. People do. You should have remembered that before you picked a dead man's hand to forge. He didn't deny it. I want to be honest with you about that, because a clean denial would almost have been easier to hear than what he actually said. I didn't think it would matter, he said. He was going to leave me the house anyway, eventually. I just moved the timeline. How was I supposed to know I was doing anything wrong, is what that sentence really meant, dressed up in nicer clothes. Inevitability, wearing the coat of an apology it never actually put on. I let the silence sit there, longer than was comfortable for either of us. Then I told him what Warren had told me an hour before he arrived, the thing that changed everything, including, I think, the shape of Corey's own grief. 2 years before he died, Arthur had restructured the estate. The house was never going to Corey. Not eventually, not someday, not through some slow-moving inheritance Corey had simply rushed. The house sat in an irrevocable trust for Silas, Corey's own 5-year-old son, a trust I would administer until Silas turned 25. Corey had spent weeks forging his way toward a house he never legally stood to inherit in the first place. He'd broken the law, backdated a document, borrowed his fiancée's uncle's signature, and put his father's memory on the line for something that had already been protected and given, quietly. 2 years before Arthur even got his diagnosis, I watched something collapse in his face that had nothing to do with the money. There's a detail that came out later, almost as an aside, that I think about more than I expected to. Renee, his fiancée, the one planning their wedding, had quietly looked into refinancing what she thought would be their future house, months before any of this happened, and hit a wall. A title search that should have surfaced the trust and didn't reach her, or did, and she never mentioned it to him. I don't know which. I've chosen not to find out. Some betrayals inside a betrayal aren't mine to untangle. The bank did not care that the truth had come out. Even with the forgery exposed, the Friday deadline wasn't stopped by revelation alone. The balloon payment came due. The business Corey had spent 2 decades building, the thing all of this had supposedly been for, collapsed on schedule 3 days later. The forgery hadn't just failed to save it. It had cost him the one thing it was meant to protect, and everything else besides. Warren told me I had every right to pursue criminal fraud charges. Forgery. Elder financial exploitation. Technically, given Arthur's condition at the time the document claimed to be signed, a prosecutor would have listened. Here's where I made the decision that I think surprised Warren more than anyone. A decision made in cold clarity, not in mercy for mercy's sake, but because I understood something Corey hadn't figured out yet about his own son. Silas was going to grow up in this family regardless of what I decided that afternoon. I could either give him a father who'd been publicly humiliated and possibly jailed, or a father who'd been quietly, firmly corrected. I told Corey I wasn't going to file anything. On one condition: he would get real financial counseling, the kind that actually helps a man stop drowning, instead of teaching him to swim faster in the same direction, paid quietly out of the estate. No fanfare, no lecture attached to it. And he would never again go near Silas's trust paperwork. Not the account, not the administration, not so much as a phone call to the bank asking about it. He didn't thank me the way people do in movies. He nodded, jaw tight, eyes somewhere on the floor between us, and said, "Okay, just that. Okay." I didn't need more than that. I wasn't looking for gratitude. I was looking for the paperwork to hold, and it did. That night, I wrote one line in the small notebook I've kept since Arthur got sick, the one I use for the nights that need marking, not the ordinary ones. He tried to forge his way into something Arthur had already given him. He just didn't know where to look. I want to give you the ledger now, because I know that's what you came for. Not just the feeling, the actual accounting of how it shook out. Corey's business is gone, closed for good, 6 weeks after that Friday deadline. The equipment was auctioned off in a gravel lot on a Saturday morning, and I heard, secondhand, that he stood at the edge of it and watched strangers load his trucks onto other people's trailers. I didn't go. I didn't need to see it to understand what it cost him, and I've never once felt the pull to make it cost more than it already had. He is, as of this recording, still in counselling, twice a month. And Warren tells me the last check-in went better than the one before it, which is the only kind of progress that matters in a story like this: small, grudging, real, never dramatic enough to make a movie out of. The financial counsellor, a woman named Marion, who Warren vouched for personally, told me once, in the careful, professional way people talk about someone else's relative, that Corey's biggest obstacle wasn't math. It was the story he'd told himself about what he was owed. Paper doesn't lie. That story did, for 30 years, and it's slower to unlearn than any balance sheet. Renee did not leave him. They postponed the wedding once, then moved forward with it in the spring, smaller than planned, in her aunt's backyard, instead of the venue they'd originally booked. I sent a gift. I did not attend. Some doors you leave unlocked without walking through them yourself. Silas is 5 years old and has no idea any of this happened. He calls me Grandma Marilyn, draws me pictures of dinosaurs he leaves on my kitchen table, and has no concept whatsoever that a house he'll grow into someday was ever anything but safe. I intend to keep it that way for as long as I possibly can. He will, someday, inherit a house that was never actually in danger, protected 2 years in advance, by a man who'd already been dead for months, by the time anyone tried to take it, and by a woman who almost signed the wrong folder at his funeral and picked up the right one by accident instead. Paper doesn't lie. People do. Arthur knew that 10 years before I did, and he spent a decade making sure the paper would still be telling the truth, long after he couldn't speak it for himself. If there's one thing I'd hand you from all of this, it's this. The people who underestimate you rarely do it out of cruelty. They do it because quiet has always looked, to them, like something they can move around at will. Let them think that, for as long as it takes you to read the document they handed you, you don't need to raise your voice to close a door. You just need to know which lock it actually has. I think about Arthur often, still, especially on Tuesdays, which was never anything special until it became the day he died and quietly took over every Tuesday after it. I think about the brown jacket, the Sunday drives with no destination, the small insistences that felt like nothing at the time and turned out to be the scaffolding holding up everything that came after. He never told me he was protecting me. He just did it, year after year, the way you'd caulk a window against a storm that hasn't arrived yet, because you know, eventually, one will. I don't know if Corey will ever fully understand what he almost destroyed, or what he actually saved by failing. Some men need the whole story laid out in front of them for years before it lands. Some never get there at all. I've made my peace with the possibility that he might be the second kind. My peace with it doesn't depend on his understanding. It depends on the paperwork holding, and it does. Sometimes dignity does not arrive with shouting. Thank you for staying with me through this one. If it moved you, tell me in the comments, and subscribe for the next story, because Marilyn Doyle isn't the last woman who ever picked up the wrong folder and found out it was exactly the right one.